Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figure It Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Figure It Out cast for, what is it, January, February, March? April! It's already April, everybody. April 2024. I'm your host, Adam Koralik, and I am joined by the evil Rob Thanos, who has returned. Welcome back, Rob.
The Ides are upon us.
Sure. Now, if you've somehow never heard this before, which is actually highly probable, welcome. We are a Patreon-backed podcast, so if you support my Patreon, you can get early access to this. You can also get early access to all my videos, as well as you can get things like shout-outs, you can get subjects selected, or you can even be on the podcast. And with us, of course, is returning champion Joseph. Welcome back, Joseph. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Adam. Thanks for having me back on.
Always a pleasure. So, we're going to start off here with a subject in your honor, though you didn't have one specifically. So actually, Rob came up with this one. Rob, would you like to take point here?
Yeah, so this is a subject. I haven't been on the podcast in a few months now just because my schedule's been crazy. But This is something I've been mentioning to Adam that we have to talk about this, because I'm actually surprised you haven't done like a normal kind of channel video discussing this, because kind of the biggest story coming out of the video game industry lately, really over the past 6 months to a year now, has been the massive amount of layoffs from developers, publishers, video game console manufacturers, of their employees. So this was a problem that really started last year in 2023, and we thought it was bad last year. But this year has been even worse, and it is continuing to snowball, really with no signs of letting up. So basically, just to read the Cliff Notes from Wikipedia article about this. So in 2023 alone, 10,000 jobs were lost in the video game industry, laid off, liquidated from the company, from different companies. This year, from just January to March, so 3 months, an additional 8,000 people have lost their jobs in the video game industry. Over 30 video game studios have laid off their entire staff and shut down. And a lot of this, there's a lot of, causes for this big layoff kind of pandemic. I'll use it, really, use that word. But I would say kind of the biggest reason for these layoffs is basically, I would say most of these, especially AAA video game developers, because this is EA is doing this, Sony is doing this. These are not small studios. Microsoft, Bethesda, Unity, Niantic, Ubisoft,
Sega
Epic Games, Sega, Bungie, Amazon Games, Free Radical Design. These are massive, massive companies that are laying off people. And I think the biggest culprit for it is the fact that during the pandemic, and you saw this jump in growth of video game companies, and there was basically a giant hiring spree. And most of these companies have now overextended, or they were unhappy with the how would you say that? The reception of certain games. Maybe a multiplayer did not work out as well. There's mergers and acquisitions. Microsoft and Sony are buying up companies left and right. So now they're having to liquidate, some of their staff. So this is a major, major problem. In my eyes. I don't know. What are you guys thinking?
So, yeah, you are right. We only talked about this on a surface level. I think even on one of the podcasts, we just kind of did an acknowledgement of it, but I don't think we did much else with it. But yeah, basically, so I'm going to be totally honest with you, I hadn't really deep dived into this. The only thing I really attributed this to was the fact that AAA games, if they aren't super successful, then they inevitably lead to like an entire company going under, and that's the kind of thing that can cause problems. But upon kind of doing more investigation, I had not really understood the COVID era part of it. I think that is actually fascinating, because I do obviously, like you guys, I remember when COVID was a very significant thing, and there was this massive surge in retro video games. I actually didn't really process that probably applied to demand for games in general. And because video game programming is one of those things that people can do from home, hypothetically, with the right setup, it makes sense that people are like, all right, then we'll hire a bunch of people who live at home and work at home, and we can, just use them to get more games content. So having that demand fall down when society kind of, shall we say, went back to normal, it does make sense they couldn't keep everyone on staff. Obviously, the AAA games factor is still a big part of it. And what was the other thing you mentioned? There was the mergers and acquisitions thing.
Yeah,
that is actually an interesting point, because both Microsoft in particular has obviously been, basically eating up a bunch of game companies. But the thing is, when they eat up these companies, they don't typically keep a lot of the employees. They're really kind of buying them just for the IP assets. Some of the talent, sure, does get to stick around, but in general, it's usually you're buying them for their IPs. And it makes a lot of sense now why they would be like, all right, well, we don't really need your staff. So you basically have this perfect storm of all this coming together to cause these problems. It's not like video games are dying. It's just doing...
No, they're more popular than ever. That's kind of the frustrating thing.
Yeah. And I don't think it's mentioned here, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's also some people, probably a minority of these people who've lost their jobs, are sort of being replaced by certain features that AI can now do. But that's a minor thing. But basically, you have this perfect storm scenario where all this stuff is coming together to cause that sort of reshuffling. This will not lead to the end of the video game industry or anything like that. It basically just means a lot of people whose passion was to get into video games likely are going to have to do either additional job hunting within the industry or perhaps have to shift jobs. But that really is unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, it's really unfortunate. Like one of the most egregious ones that I would point to that happened in the past couple months was Sony Interactive laid off about 8% of their video game development staff, about 900 people. And these are from Insomniac Games that just launched PS5's biggest exclusive, like last year, Spider-Man 2.
Yeah. Yep.
So they're getting cut. Naughty Dog, Last of Us Part 2 just had a remaster this year. And as this game is coming out, they're gutting the studio. Because it's like, oh, we're going to hire a bunch of people to make sure we can ramp up development. And then once it's on cruise control or we're getting towards the end of the finish line, then we're just going to cut it all. So it's like, how does that, what's the perception as a game developer that you're at the studio, you're doing good work, you're selling these massive games that are making Sony money hand over fist, and now basically as a result of the bottom line, you're getting lost in the shuffle, you're getting cut out of that.
To be quite honest, in the cases like that, like, oh, Spider-Man 2 just came out, or Last of Us Part 2, or Last of Us Remastered Part 1, or whatever, just came out, oh, look, I don't have a job anymore. I'm going to be completely honest, guys. That's video game industry SOP. People are always laid off when a project is completed. That's about 50% of the reason why, as a software developer, I am not making games. Like, that's been a thing for, like, at the very least, last 15, 20 years. Like, we've been in, like, back when the Great Recession happened, like, people were losing jobs left and right as well. Like, this is not as unusual as people seem to think it is.
I think it's more about the perception, though, because, and also the fact that a lot of these games are ongoing projects now. The fact that DLC has become like a larger part of the video game industry, live service games where there is no end to a game's development. It continues to go. You're continuing to add things, a la Fortnite or Sea of Thieves or something like that. Like, these games aren't like, okay, let's put a little bow on the game and put it out, and it's complete. Now we can move on to something else, or we could reduce our staff. I think it's a difficult thing to say that you could be losing very talented and valued parts of your development teams.
Oh, yeah,
when these games are shipping broken, incomplete, or are needing constant updates in order to keep up revenue through live service games.
Yes, but then this might get slightly political, but the C-suite and these companies do not care.
No, they don't. It's about the bottom line.
Yeah. So, a game is out. Oh, we still need to fix the bugs, or we have DLC. Well, we don't need the entire staff for that. Fire all of these people. It's fine. Mm-hmm. And this is also, honestly, in this time around, it's also not really just video game people who are being fired. Like, the tech industry itself for the past, same amount of time has been firing people left and right because of, apparently COVID pandemic, overhiring, bottom line, and trying to, now do the bottom line, but also, all the venture capital money, that's dried up. So they don't have as much access to very low interest loans that they used to have to be able to ramp up. It's also
that's actually a really interesting.
That's also another reason why all those streaming services are now jettisoned in projects as well.
Yeah, because tax write-offs and the like. Yeah.
All the money spigot has basically dried up.
It's interesting you bring that up because that's actually directly correlated to demographics, and it's mostly has to do with the fact that all the boomers are retiring. When they were still in the workforce, they were still investing their money, so capital was cheap. Now that they're all retiring, they don't want to invest in things, they just want cash assets, so they basically pulled their money out. In other words, investment capital, like you're talking about, is too expensive to be worth the effort. Hence, this is just kind of a perfect storm of all of this coming in together in one spot. It's basically kind of made the gaming industry kind of a contract for hire type of situation, which is not new exactly. It's just that the public didn't necessarily know that. What I think Rob is trying to say is this makes them look really bad, and I guess that is true, but at the same time, you're right, this is nothing new. And as we both said right at the beginning, despite all this, the gaming industry has never been more successful. So despite the, shall we say, public outcry about, oh, how could you fire all these people, they're still supporting it anyway. They are voting with their wallets. I guess I can't actually blame a company for doing the sole function of a company, which is to generate profits.
Yeah. I mean, and part of this, part of my frustration with this is, putting on my, armchair socialist beret and saying, all these capitalist, companies are evil or whatever. But it's I think when you boil it down to it, there is more than enough money and there's more than enough demand for video games around that should negate something like this, or at least limit it. The fact that it's becoming as big a problem as it is, I mean, remember, we're talking about nearly 20,000 people, and the video game industry is big, but it's not massive. These are, 20,000 is a significant portion of video game development staff. Almost 20,000 people getting laid off in a year and a half during a fiscal year when the video game industry as a whole, according to this website, registered $187.7 billion in revenue. So, a lot of this is about protecting these companies' bottom line for shareholders and for investors. Because if they could say, listen, maybe this game got delayed or didn't perform as well as it could, and we need to keep reporting more and more profit hand over fist year after year, we're going to start, basically, the revolution is going to eat its own. And we're going to have to cannibalize from the inside to basically make the bottom line to keep growing. Because that's the big thing that to take away from what you've been saying, Adam, is like the video game industry is stronger than ever. There's as big a demand, if not more, than any other time in history for new video games, for new hardware, for new experiences. And when companies are valuing the profit side as opposed to the innovation or the growth side, continuing to ride this wave and to innovate, to iterate, and to grow the business, suddenly, well, not suddenly, it's always been about this, but like, you're starting to see a larger shift towards prioritizing gain and profit over the well-being of your company.
So what you're effectively describing is the video game version of what's happening to Boeing. Where they're, Boeing, obviously,
except my Xbox isn't exploding and, threatening to kill
Right,
people.
of course. But if anybody has been paying attention to the news lately, of course, Boeing's got a lot of problems because a lot of their planes are kind of falling apart because apparently they're cutting corners in an effort because they're extremely pressed to make sure they have profits. Therefore, they're cutting safety standards, which is obviously a huge problem. It's kind of the same mentality if you take the video game industry to the next extreme. They're effectively hollowing themselves out just to have a press release that says we made this much money, as opposed to we made this much innovation or we cared this much about quality standards, et cetera, et cetera. And if you follow what's happening to Boeing, hypothetically where this could go with video games. Like, does it reach that point where video games, obviously it's not dangerous if your game doesn't work, but if a game is so broken that you burn that, base enough times, will they continue to want to support you? That's effectively what I think you're basically getting at.
I think the thing, and like you could equate this to Boeing too, and like the issue of like oversight or kind of cutting corners. There's an interesting article that came out a couple days ago. One of the lead developers for Baldur's Gate 3, one of the biggest games that was released last year, was commented on like these ongoing layoffs, and he referred to it as, quote, a avoidable fuck up. It is, these industry-wide layoffs are not inevitable just because of the inertia of the industry. This is basically, it's a snowball effect where you started to see maybe some developers with real issues, needing to cut corners in order to stay afloat. And larger companies or mid-sized companies that maybe aren't doing as bad, looking at this and saying, okay, well, they're doing it, we can too. We've been wanting to cut this for ages and cut size. So everybody else is, why don't we? It's kind of like, the industry is eating its own tail, basically.
Mm-hmm. Same with tech. With tech in general.
Yep.
Yeah.
The Facebook and Twitter layoffs sparked everyone else to start laying off as well.
Yeah.
One thing I want to say on both of these, and I don't mean to sound like I'm defending these major corporations doing this, but one thing we have to factor is we look at these numbers of how many employees go, and we're like, wow, they were all valuable parts of the company. We don't actually know any of the intimate details. Like, there could be people there whose job is completely superfluous right now, and I'll give you, like, an example of that. Pre-pandemic, one of the highest priorities a lot of companies had for advertising purposes, they would have these creative teams that would come together to host like massive number of events and things where you have all these people you've brought out to basically do these big PR stunts. But during the pandemic, a lot of companies realized that A, we could just kind of do this digitally, and B, a lot of the gaming audience doesn't like to travel anyway. So a lot of people in that side of things were likely, terminated simply because they didn't need those types of jobs anymore, or they just needed less people on staff to care about it. So I guess what I'm saying is some jobs that get eliminated aren't just because, hey, we need to improve our bottom line. It's more like we just don't need that job done anymore because it's antiquated. Yeah. So I'm not saying that's always the case, obviously, but it wouldn't shock me if at least there's a good chunk of people in that group who that's the situation. Their job is just unnecessary at this point.
Yeah, especially in the case of the mergers, like when Microsoft bought Activision, they probably didn't need a lot of the management staff or stuff like that there if they're getting integrated into Microsoft's like corporate structure as well.
100%. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, this is a gross over exaggeration, but like if you have a guy at Activision who's responsible for making sure your games get onto a physical disc, and you have a guy over at Bethesda who's got the same job, and then you have a guy at Microsoft who has the same job, then all the companies merge together. You don't need 3 people for that same job. I know that's a gross simplification, but you get my point. Like, there's going to be redundancies when it comes to mergers. Hence, people are released.
And I mean, yes, there is, when you're dealing with the mergers and acquisitions of things and kind of liquidating and consolidating and like that, that I could see a little bit more. I think all of us have said that we've seen some issue with, companies like Sony or Microsoft buying up developers only to shut these development studios down and reallocate those people somewhere else, or, it's a bad look. But I think when you're talking about redundancies in people, I think a lot of the jobs that are being lost probably are a lot more valued than the people at the top that are making the decisions to cut them. And this is a little bit of apples and oranges, but my mind always goes to back in 2013 or so. There's a very famous story of Nintendo when they were really in their worst straits they possibly have ever been in during the Wii U and 3DS era. Their company is on the rocks, and there's a lot of threat that Nintendo isn't going to be able to rebound from this. And in order to keep the company afloat, rather than lay off people that are doing the work, boots on the ground in the trenches, as you were, making the games that are going to turn your company around, laying those people off, Nintendo CEO at the time, Satoru Iwata, rest in peace, cut his own salary by 50%. And cut all of the board members' salaries by 20% so they would not have to lay people off. Now, I'm not making Nintendo out to be this paragon of fucking virtue and ethics. Would they do this again? We don't really know. But I think that says something to the character of somebody like Satoru Iwata, who cared greatly about his company, cared greatly about his employees, and continuing to make Nintendo, games and consoles a reality. So
I don't want to get too much into the social side of things, but that's probably also due to the fact that Japan has more of a we're a team mentality than most Western countries do.
Also, from something I've read, there's probably also certain laws involved that make that something that has to happen first before you can even fire people to keep your business afloat. I remember reading somewhere where, if you're laying off people because you're saying that you need to do it for the business reason, you need to have documented proof that you've done everything else possible first, or something like that. I don't know how accurate that actually is, but it would make sense that legal stuff like that happening in Japan and not here could be due to legal reasons.
Yeah, that wouldn't entirely shock me. But I mean, I don't know that. I'm just speculating, but I'm with Joseph on that. It wouldn't shock me at all if that was a thing. But yeah, so we'll have to see where this goes. I think the core point that Rob is making is that this seems unjust. And it does seem like we're hollowing out these companies in an effort to just focus on profits a la Boeing. But, we'll just have to see over the course of time. I think the only part of this that's hypothetically truly scummy is if you are hired by a major corporation like a Sony, a Microsoft, or whatever it is, and you're told, you have a job, you're good, you just work on these games and you're good. And then they fire you as soon as you finish the job successfully. That's bad. But it's different if you're look, you're a contract hire. We will pay you until the game is done. Then going into it, I'm only here temporarily. That's different. It's kind of like if you get an Uber, you don't expect to keep paying dividends to the guy indefinitely, nor does he expect that because it's a contract hire for a one-time thing. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, contract hires are also explicitly not counted in layoffs. So none of these people we're talking about are laid off. The whole reason tech uses a lot of contractors is so when a project's over, they're they're let go, they don't have to report that they laid off like 50,000 people or however many
Right.
people they had.
And that's the point I'm making, Joseph, is that basically rather than hire them and tell them you have a secure job, you approach it like it's a contract gig. Now, I grant you that's much easier for me to say than it is for them to execute, but that's hypothetically something that I think would make this look better. But at the same time, we must just understand they are making more money than they ever really have, and they probably aren't too likely to care. But this also does somewhat incentivize teams to drag their feet on games, which is not good. And it does incentivize them to be like, well, let's force DLC into this. Let's make the game broken so that we're, employed long enough to be able to work on patches. This is not healthy. And I don't know how sustainable it ultimately is, but at the time, for the time anyway, it looks like it's going to hold.
Oh, no, I mean, I think this is going to get worse before it gets better. Absolutely.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, it's, I mean, my bottom line is that, with the record profits of last year, and, I think it says a lot of something for a company like Sony, for instance, that, a year ago spent almost $4 billion to buy a development studio. And, so they have the money to spend, but they don't have the money to maintain. And they don't have the money to grow. It's now about consolidation and kind of lining the pockets. And that's my biggest issue, is that, it's all evidence to the contrary says that this is an industry that should be growing as it was growing during the pandemic because there is demand. And what I will say, if there's any silver lining to this, is that maybe a small to mid-level independent studio or maybe a AA video game developer is going to maybe be a little bit more hesitant to agree to be acquired by a larger company like Microsoft or Sony, because they might see it's like, oh, EA's done this where they've bought studios and close just to close them and cancel games that are in development. And now Sony has like their biggest development studios, Insomniac and Naughty Dog, giving them like their only really acclaimed first-party games, and now you're being punished for your success. So I don't know.
All right. Well, I think we've said our piece, gentlemen. So let's move on. Joseph, thank you for that subject that Rob picked. So the next one up, it comes from Patreon backer Spencer Purrier. Always shout out to him. Thank you so much for supporting. His question was kind of simple and yet depressing. It was, how does it feel seeing games you grew up with be considered old classics? And so for this kind of thing, it's like I remember, something like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 coming out, and like I remember the marketing behind it for the Genesis, and it was just like this big game. Like I was there, man. I was in the trenches and in the school ground, and just being like, all right, like we're gonna argue about this. What's better, this or Mario, and all that. And now it's like this game that's just, kids play it in like a collection on their phone, and it's just like considered this historic piece of, gaming history. But how does that impact you and your mentality, I guess, relative to your age? Because the obvious answer is that it just makes you feel old.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like, makes me feel a lot older than I should be feeling, to be honest. But
I don't know. I don't necessarily makes me feel old. I think it makes me feel young. I think it makes me feel validated that gaming experiences that I valued so much as a kid, like in the trenches, as you said, on the blacktop, in your console wars, talking about a game like Streets of Rage or Ristar or Sonic on the Sega Genesis, it's 30 years later, it's 35, 40 years later, in some cases, and these games are still bringing joy to a new generation. I mean, I think it's funny, like as a teacher, I see my kids play video games every day, especially during class when I'm trying to teach. And you know what games they play the most? They play Pac-Man. They play Snake. They play Tetris. Like these games, they're classics back then, and they're classics now, and they will be. I think that's saying something. So, in fact, it made me feel like if those games, like a Sonic the Hedgehog, for instance, was not a classic and died with me. Its relevance and love died with me and the people that I grew up with. I think that's what really makes you feel old. If the kids were on their holodecks playing, Space Pirate, Fairy Wizard 25, whatever.
That legendary gem of a game.
Yes, of course. And then I would be like, okay, well, I've lost all relevance. Like, the fact, these games are still being appreciated, that makes me feel young. That means that I could rock up to some kids playing Super Smash Brothers, and which I absolutely do, and curb stomp them into oblivion, and say, I've been playing this game since 1999. You can't touch me. That's your collective consciousness and your collective appreciation of classic games.
That's an interesting point, because I know I've told this story before, but it kind of harps back to when the Genesis and the SNES were relevant, and I really wanted one, and my mom just gave me her old Atari 2600. And so that's what I had for a year or half a year, whatever it was. And I would go to school and everybody's talking about Sonic or Donkey Kong or Mario or whatever. And I was like, anybody play Space Invaders? And you just felt really out of touch. But at the same time, it's in hindsight, I think you're right. It does kind of make you feel younger to have other people understand that reference. As opposed to being that person, because at the time, nobody understood what I was talking about, which does make you feel like the old fogey who only gets the things that the kids don't understand. So, in a way, when you talk about obscure games that are only obscure because they were unsuccessful or whatever it is, when, if I talk to, my cousin has kids, right, and they're, high school age, middle school age, and if I talk to them about, you're right, something like Smash Brothers, they know exactly what I'm talking about. But if I'm like, hey, do you guys remember Gunstar Heroes? They're like, what? No idea what I'm talking about. And so that's an interesting case. Not that I necessarily have some great desire to pretend like I'm in high school, because that's kind of pathetic when you're 37. But at the same time, yes, that is an interesting point about how old it may or may not make you feel.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my thought process of when you're talking in conversation about stuff being classics, you just think, oh, right, this thing is 30 years old and I'm 36, and oh god, even though 36 is not actually old. It just feels like it, mostly because I mean, that's partially just because it's what do you mean this is 30 years old already? I remember playing it, feeling like I just played it for the first time 3 years ago, even though that was not the case. But I mean, it's different. It's not the same as seeing kids nowadays playing old school Sonic, even though they know it's old but they're still playing it and having fun. That's different. When you hear the word classic, you think stuff that people are basically forced you to read in high school and stuff like that.
It's interesting, because part of this is also the social element of how long does it take for you to feel old. You might have noticed over time, on Twitter, I tend to try and find things to make people feel old. When I did this post when I was there's been more time between the release of the PlayStation 2 and today than there was between the release of the Atari 2600 and the PlayStation 2. I kind of like to make people feel old. But we also live in a time where, as they say, 40's the new 30, stuff like that. And I actually, this is gonna slightly veer into politics, but I promise it's not really meant to be political. I'm just making a point. You guys must know Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so I'm sure when you right, history, good. And so you probably know how he died, cerebral hemorrhage. He was, while he was in his fourth term, he was this old decaying man who just kind of keeled over, right? Do you know how old he actually was?
Yeah, he was in his late 60s or...
He was 62.
Yeah.
That's it, 62. That's still part of the workforce in 2024. Retirement age is 65. Yeah. So... And that's looking to be extended. So my point is, and if you look up photos of him, he just looks like this, he looks like your elderly great grandfather. And then partially that's the stress of the war and all that. But my point is,
I mean, he was president for a long time, and that job just ages you.
Yeah, that's fair. But like, you look at where people are, where humanity is as far as aging. I know there was a meme not too long ago about Ernie Hudson because of the new Ghostbusters movie. He's like 75 and he looks like he's 40 because he's all like ripped and stuff. And we're just at a point now where we're all kind of living longer, and there's a certain expectation of like what old even is. Like, I'm 37 now, right? So like a couple generations ago, like I would be expected to be like gearing up for retirement and possible death. Whereas like now it's like, oh dude, I remember high school last week, even though obviously that was like 20 years ago. But it's just, society is just kind of changed in that regard. So I guess what I would say is, to people, at least millennials, I can speak for millennials, I suppose, we don't tend to feel as old as our parents did. In part because we also kind of started everything like 10 years later. Like your average age span for somebody who was trying to buy a house or whatever used to be in like their mid to late 20s and start a family around the same time. Now it's like mid to late 30s is the average to start for that because of millennials. And I know this really doesn't have anything to do specifically with the original question, but my point is, I guess you don't necessarily feel as old seeing that stuff as we probably should, just because of social change external to video games. So when I see, as Rob said, you see a kid appreciating something you grew up on as like a storied franchise that to you was just a big release at the time, that is kind of rewarding to know that at least part of what made your childhood special makes some future generations' childhood special. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a very good point, again, from Rob, that it's unfortunate that there are these games that we loved that were just unsuccessful or obscure, and future generations likely do not care and never will.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on this, guys?
I would say, just wrap up, to that last point. If you get the opportunity to expose a classic game to somebody young that wouldn't have otherwise like discovered it, do it. Take the chance, because so much of my time interacting with students is being able to expose them to really cool things that they wouldn't have found before. Like, I brought in a bunch of handhelds last year, and they were playing, Sega Game Gear, and they were playing, Atari Lynx games, and they were having a blast. They enjoyed these games. They actually said, oh, can I get this on Steam? Is this available somewhere? And I have to be like, no, not always. Appreciate it when you can, because, never underestimate the joy of play and the joy of just having something fun and simple in your hands. Because connections will be made, regardless whether the kid's 5 years old or 50. Yeah.
There is a certain argument to what you're saying about, like, the simplicity of games being better in that sense, because yes, that's more universally appealing. And also, as a side point to that, and kind of goes back to the first point about the industry changing. The industry changing, the employees who are there are effectively the first generation that really grew up an entire lifetime only knowing video games as their existence, because I would argue most of the workforce now preparing video games are probably millennials, and they are we millennials are the second generation to ever have video games. They were introduced during Gen X, but kind of in the mid to late tier of Gen X a little bit. So I guess what I'm saying is, our generation grew up being like, here are the things I wish could be done on my Sega Genesis. Here's things I wish could be done on my Super Nintendo. Our imagination was expanding and believing on this like big open world type of thing that just wasn't possible with the technology. So when we got into the workforce to make video games, we started producing content just like that. But there is an argument to be said for things like Gen Z or whatever the new gen is now, the one that's the kids of the millennials. Is that what they're called? Alphas? Yeah. That when they're playing games, that they don't necessarily see all these big open worlds and all that as the thing that is super appealing. It might even be considered daunting to some extent. Hence, games like things like even as simplistic as like Candy Crush do remain popular. There is an argument to that, and I guess that's something that the gaming industry itself will have to kind of wrestle with. And I know we still have that. You still have like options on Steam, and all that sort of thing, but it's harder, I think, for a game like that to get as much global traction as it used to be. It'll be very interesting to see where all of this eventually goes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. How long has it been since Minecraft came out?
It came out in like 2012, I think, 2013.
Okay, so yeah,
really, that's
people who like whose first foundational gaming experience was that are about to be at the age where they can like actually be making video games as like part of like AAA studios, if they're not already there. So that might be interesting to see.
Yeah.
We'll see how that inspires, because that's one thing. The generation that plays this stuff does get inspired to make the future content. And, yeah, looking forward to seeing how it plays out. Any other thoughts on this, guys?
No.
Nope.
Yeah,
all right,
no,
then
I'm
what
good.
we're going to do now... All right, well, Joseph, thank you very much for joining us, of course. And Spencer, thank you very much for that particular subject. So now I have a round of shout-outs here. The following people are Patreon backers, and they are at the tier in which they get a shout-out. We've got Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, and Trey Wagner. Once again, that is Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, and Trey Wagner. Thank you so much for your support. And anybody out there, again, if you want to support the Patreon, I appreciate it. You get the podcast, you get early access to videos, you get shout-outs if you want them, subjects, and you can even potentially be on here again. So thank you, Joseph, for joining us and partaking. And we're back. We are now joined by Abdullah. Welcome back, dude.
Hi, happy to be back with the monotonous
you.
voice again.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it's been a minute, and now Rob is back with you. When was the last time you guys were both on one together?
It
Feels
been a while, actually.
like the first time. Feels like the very first time.
I assume this is a musical reference that I don't get, which is good.
All musical references you don't get.
That is true. That I can't actually dispute that. But okay, so let's just go ahead and get into it. So Abdullah, you got to pick a subject, although you didn't really have one, so we kind of came up with something that I thought would be kind of interesting to talk about, because I think it's indisputable. The three of us, we enjoy our retro video game consoles. And I've always wondered, like, you know, I guess what I thought was it would be kind of interesting to see, like, what retro video game consoles would you want new games for? And you can approach that from two different ways. You can look at, like, the independent scene of, you know, like, say, the Dreamcast or the NES. They still get new games through that. But might be more interesting to approach the question from the perspective of, if you could just suddenly get, like, a major company like a Ubisoft or an EA or whatever it is to suddenly pump out new games for a legacy console, regardless of how illogical that might sound, which console would you pick, and is there any particular titles you'd love to see, like, official demakes for, I guess?
I'm going to go Virtual Boy.
Really?
Yeah.
That's not what I expected of you.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, would it be cool to have GameCube? Of course it would be cool to have GameCube. Would it be
That's
cool
what
to
I
have, like,
expected.
Saturn or Genesis? But it's like, yeah, it's all right, but, like, those libraries are huge and fantastic already. You know, I would like to see games for underappreciated or underutilized video game consoles. You know, which the Virtual Boy is both of those. You know, I think there's, 18 or...
I want to say like 22, but you could definitely be right. It's not big.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, and there is, like, a cool homebrew community for it. Like, I've got Hyper Fighting, which is like Street Fighter 2 for
that's
the
like the
Virtual
definitive
Boy.
one.
You know, and...
Do you have the actual release of it?
I do, yeah.
I wish I had bought that. I didn't have a Virtual Boy at the time.
Yeah. So, you know, there is, like, a homebrew community for it, and there's also been a pretty good groundswell of support for getting, like, prototypes and, like, beta builds of games that were not released. Like, I think Faceball was one of those, which was on the Game Boy, if I recall. Like, so there's, like, that version, like, they kind of ported it to the Virtual Boy. There's, like, a Super Mario Brothers or Super Mario Land game that was never released for it. Mario Kart, I think they've been working on lately. So, you know, I like those homebrews, and I think it's, you know, it's doing the good work of keeping the Virtual Boy alive. But, you know, having official stuff for it, like, that'd be great.
So I'm going to ask you another question, but you get time to think about it while Abdullah and I answer. So think of it this way. I want you, Rob, to pick a company specifically and pick like a game for it. Whether this is like a dumb example, like be like, okay, I want Ubisoft to make an Assassin's Creed for the Virtual Boy. I just want you to think of what game franchise you would want to see brought over to it.
Okay.
And the same question will eventually go to you, Abdullah, and of course to myself. But in the meantime, just to answer the first part of the question, Abdullah, if you could pick a system that suddenly these companies were just like, hey, we're going to make a few new games for, which one would it be?
This is not an easy question. I wanted to say GameCube.
Okay, any particular reason for that?
If you come down to Nintendo, it's always the same. I would say.
So what you're really saying is you do want to back the Virtual Boy as well.
Oh no, definitely not. Actually, funny enough, because I tried that console recently, not too long ago. I tried that, and
really?
my eyes hurt. Yeah, I got one, and it hurts.
Wait, you got a Virtual Boy suddenly?
Oh, not suddenly. It was planned, but I did eventually get it. It was a plan. Obviously, I had to pay a lot, but that's why it took me some time.
Wait, when did you get a Virtual Boy?
A few months back. So I used to have one, but I got that one at a low price because it was broken. But now I've got a proper one, and I wasted my money.
What games do you have for it? Do you have any, or you just have like a flash card?
It was the Tetris, I think, that horrible one.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, to each their own. All right, so I'll go with mine. So the initial answer I would have given was pretty obvious. I would have said, yeah, it'd be cool to have like new games on the Dreamcast, but that's kind of a given. I also feel I'm a little spoiled there because we do have the independent scene. So I will admit, Rob, you kind of changed my mind with your argument. That's a pretty good, compelling argument. But I'm going to meet a little bit in the middle on this because, like, as much as I joke about it, I don't really want new Casio Loopy games. Like, I'm never really going to play those. I'm of two mindsets here. On the one hand, I would really like to see what a new developer could really do with the Sega Saturn, like really diving into it. And I also feel that way about the 32X. Especially with the CD-ROM drive, so the Sega CD 32X combo. Which, fun fact, by the way, Sega never officially gave that a name, but they did once refer to it as The Machine. So I guess the most official name it ever got for that combination is The Machine. But I think if I actually really try to go with Rob's perspective on this, like what's a system that's underappreciated that I think would be cool to really see someone dig into, that's obscure, I would probably go with the Apple Pippin.
Yeah.
That was the most powerful console in the 5th generation, and like most people have never even heard of it. And I'm just curious, like what it could have actually done, and like what would be capable of being made on it. Especially because I mean it's not open PC architecture, obviously, but it is similar in the sense that it was Mac stuff. So it's like theoretically a bunch of stuff from that era could have been brought over, and some of it was. But I'd be very curious to see what somebody could dig into it with. I'm gonna have to think on a specific title. Like if you could see like a demake or something, like what would you want to bring over to it? But Rob, have you thought of something specific you would want to do?
Yeah, I would like for the Virtual Boy, I would like Way Forward to make a Shantae game for the Virtual Boy.
Huh. That's actually a legit answer. That's something that
because it's like they do really cool work with like pixel art, so it's like they would know how to develop a game for like a 32-bit system. I think they could probably find some interesting like depth of field things to do with the 3D perspective of it. Yeah, I'm going like I think Way Forward has the creativity and technical know-how to make a Shantae game for the Virtual Boy.
God, that's such a better answer than what I've got.
That's just me in a nutshell, baby. I'm all about the better answers.
Yeah. Yeah, apparently in this case, I'll give you a bonus point. You actually like have a better answer. You like literally changed both Abdullah and my minds, and like you're like, well, I have a real answer. Because what I was gonna say is in that context, because partially what inspired this question was something that I had thought about previously. There's a guy named I want to say his name is Bullfrog, He's a guy on Twitter. He's the dude doing like basically ports of like Metal Gear Solid over to the Saturn, Metal Gear Solid 2 to the Dreamcast. He's working on a Star Wars Rogue Squadron game for the Dreamcast. I don't know if you've heard of any of this, Rob.
No,
but I was kind of thinking about that and like what other systems hypothetically would I want to see stuff like that come out, but rather than have it be a fan project, like what if you could get a company on board to do it? That's where Dreamcast I thought made sense. But anyway, no one would in their right mind would develop for the Pippin. I mean, Apple made it and they even didn't. But I guess if I were going to say anything, I think along those lines, I probably actually would go with, this is going to sound insane because it wasn't even a game I was a huge fan of, and I'm going to piss a lot of people off when I say this, but Halo.
Yeah,
specifically
totally.
The first one. Bringing that to the Pippin would be interesting because it has Marathon, which was effectively the precursor to Halo in some ways. And to see them both on the same system, I think would have been kind of interesting. The controller on that does have that little ball mouse thing. So hypothetically, for FPSs, as awkward as that weird boomerang shape is, it would have hypothetically, once you got used to it, would have given you more precision potentially for first-person shooters. I say that without actually trying to do that, because as far as I know, there are no FPSs of any kind on the Pippin. And so maybe that would be this horrible nightmare that wouldn't be enjoyable at all. But it would be kind of interesting to see that game in particular brought over to that system, because it technically has its roots in the Pippin. So that would have just been kind of interesting. Now, obviously, in a fantasy world where I get to do whatever I want, I'd be like, oh yeah, give me my Shenmue 3 on my Dreamcast. But that's such an obvious answer. I wanted to go with something more interesting. I don't know. I'm trying to think. Like some of my other favorite game franchises being brought over to various systems would be cool. Like I would want to see maybe some of the Resident Evil games get brought over to things like the Dreamcast and Saturn. Seeing the Resident Evil 2 game brought to the Saturn like it should have been would be cool to see like fulfilled. I don't know. Any other ideas like that? Any other ones either of you guys got? Like, if I were to come to you and say, hey, Nintendo told me that they're willing to bring over Super Mario Wonder to the GameCube. It's going to be a D-make. You're saying you don't want that?
Oh, no. But probably Wii games, though, because I hate that controller.
Oh, yeah. I could see, like, because you could run, like, a Dolphin emulator online and kind of play Wii and GameCube games on the same emulator, because the architecture is so similar. Like, that'd be interesting. Like, Mario Galaxy on the
GameCube,
the GameCube with like a normal control scheme or something like that.
Yeah,
would be kind of cool.
Super Mario Brothers Wii.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's like so many. I mean, Adam, better than anybody. So many Wii games that you want to play that you can't get past the fucking control scheme. So
yeah, I hate the controls in that system, as you full well know, but. Yeah, Super Mario or Mario Kart Wii brought over to the GameCube. Granted, that one is probably easy because you can actually play that one with a GameCube controller. But yeah, I'm not talking about so much games that would actually be like technically possible. I'm talking fantasy world. Like Nintendo comes to you and says, we will take a modern game and we will demake it down for the GameCube or whatever it is.
Oh, probably Odyssey.
None you would be interested in trying?
Oh, no, in that case, definitely. Mario Odyssey, maybe. That'd probably be a good one.
I want Metroid Prime remastered, demastered for the GameCube.
You mean the original? Congratulations!
Yeah, exactly.
You invented the original.
Exactly. That game's perfect.
All right. Well, I don't think we're going to top that particular answer. So I guess we could just move on because that's just a nice joke answer to end it all on. But yeah, I don't know. That's something I'm going to ask the audience too. Like while you're out there, like I know the premise of the question is a little weird because I find D-makes to be fascinating because they're usually fan-oriented. Like, didn't somebody do, like, a Bloodborne D-make that looks like a PS1 version, although it only runs on PC? There's stuff like that. And basically, first of all, I guess, where do you sit on the concept of D-makes? And I guess we could all have that conversation for a minute. But to the audience, where do you sit on the position of D-makes? And do you have a particular game you love enough that you'd be interested in seeing what a D-make would look like on an older generation system, and if so, what system? So, I guess, we think about it here. How do you guys feel about that concept of D-makes?
I love them because it's such an interesting way to express your love for a video game console. and like real also use your benefit of hindsight and modern technology to really work within the constraints of a classic system. The ones that really blow my mind have been for like the Atari 2600.
Like Halo 2600?
Halo 2600 made by guys from Bungie. Like a love letter to the Atari. Like, the game is competent. It's not Halo, but it's a very competently made game, and the way they finagled the system to be able to run some of this is incredible. The other one, which I swear to God, I really wish I had a cartridge of. It was another Atari Age demake, like a homebrew for it. It's called Princess Rescue for the Atari 2600, and it is a demake of Super Mario Brothers for the NES on the Atari. And somehow I don't know what they did, but they're able to get like scrolling background screens and stuff and basically run a functional Super Mario Brothers game, not Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers game on the Atari 2600. And it's remarkable. It looks great, like really good pixel art running on actual Atari hardware. If you've never seen it, look it up. It's amazing what they did.
So, my favorite one, or at least the one I should say that I spent the most time with, because I have to be completely fair here. Like, as much as I like the concept of demakes, I'd be lying if I said I actually regularly play any of them. I would be curious. There are certain titles that could grasp my interest if I tried, but the one that I probably spent the most time with is a game called Mighty Mighty Missile, which was a demake of Choo Choo Rocket for the Sega CD. And it's really good. It's actually really good. So that one I had a lot of fun playing, and it's probably the game I spent more time playing on the Sega CD than any other, which is ironic. How about you, Abdullah? Do you have any? I mean, where do you stand on demakes, or do you just not really care?
Whilst you guys were talking, I was trying to think of an example of a remake. So I was thinking of horrible of games that are not so good currently, and they probably would scale that down and they'd be better. So in my head, I just started thinking about Sonic games. Because when you when you mention Sonic, the first thing people are going to say, "Oh, 2D was better," right? So, and the first thing I said, "Okay, what about Sonic Unleashed?" And then I remember that maybe people don't know this. Some people don't know this, but there's an actual Sonic Unleashed on mobile phone version. I think there is a mobile phone version, but it's like no one knows about it.
Isn't there? Am I wrong? Is there a DS version of that?
There
Unleashed?
is,
No.
I believe. Oh no,
Sonic
that's Sonic.
Unleashed?
Yeah.
Colors, the one that has it. So I was thinking,
Okay, all right.
yeah, there are some Sonic games that people may not like the 3D part of, so maybe they make those. The Sonic Unleashed an example.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting idea.
Maybe also,
Yeah.
well, not other than Sonic, because it's probably one of the famous examples in which people would say it used to be good. Unlike,
Sure. Okay, I can see that.
at the top of my head, actually. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay. Well, all right. I think we've said our piece on this, so we will move on. Abdullah, thank you for the subject, even though technically you didn't pick it, but that's cool. So the next one up, and our last subject here, comes from Sinjeet, who is a backer who also gets to pick a subject. And he just wanted us to have more of a philosophical discussion. And I know, Rob, you and I have, I think, talked privately about this, but haven't necessarily put it to a podcast before. Given the direction, we're kind of rounding it out here with that first subject we started off with, which is, given the kind of the direction that the industry is going, and the probability that the traditional home console as we know it is likely coming to an end, which doesn't mean video games are ending, that's not what we're saying. How do we actually feel about that kind of probable, almost inevitability?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like to quote my favorite Marvel character, it's inevitable.
Yeah, Rob Thanos, exactly.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it really depends on when you ask me. If you had asked me, 5-10 years ago, like, okay, consoles are coming to an end, how do you feel? I would be like, the sky is falling. You know, this is the end of the fucking world. You know, and now I'm just like, I know it's coming, and I think part of that has been my opening up to more digital gaming than I did back in the day. Like, I have Xbox Game Pass. I love Game Pass. You know, I do have some digital games. If I can't get it physically, I will buy it digitally. So, you know, the idea of not owning your games and not being able to, you know, have a video game console and physical games. Yeah, I mean, now I probably be like, okay, that's going to suck. I'm going to miss it. I can tell you it's not going to happen within the next 10 years because Nintendo's obviously got another console coming out, and Xbox has already said that they're working on a new console. So,
well, I'm glad. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I do want to preface this because I probably should have done this before. When we basically are saying the end of consoles, we're not talking about like, oh, they'll never make any sort of hardware again, although that probably will happen eventually too. But we're basically saying the way we think of consoles now. Traditional consoles meaning a physical media device that, you know, you go and you get actual, like, either discs or carts or whatever for. A streaming box or even a digital-only download box is not something that I would actually consider to be a real console because it's effectively a worthless brick at a certain point, whereas a physical console, say a Sega Saturn, will work well beyond its support date because it's not dependent upon being online in order to operate. That's basically what we're kind of saying. And so with that understanding, understand what Rob means by that, which is probably within 10 years, we will not have new video game systems that have either disk drives or any sort of card slot, possibly with the sole exception of Nintendo for different reasons. But even they, I think, are getting a little tired of physical media. But anyway, sorry, go on, Rob.
Yeah, but so I think we've got one more console generation left in us. You know, your a metaphorical PS6, you know, generation, where whether it's digital or all digital or not is another question. But I think we've got at least another console cycle, another generation ahead of us. So by that point, I'm going to be, you know, in my late 40s, and I might not just give a fuck anymore. So I'm just like, I'm just going to play on my PC or my holodeck, you know, room at home. You know, who the fuck knows, you know. But right now, it would be sad. But then again, it's like, you know, me and you, Adam, we're historians. We have consoles that we're going to be enjoying for the rest of our life.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on exactly the same page here. Minus, like, I, unlike Rob, have not in any way at all embraced digital gaming, and I know I never will. I find it like almost, this is going to be very intentionally hyperbolic, extreme, so I'm joking here when I say this, but I find digital gaming morally reprehensible. That's a joke.
I think you should be shot if you download.
I should be canceled for having an opinion. No, in all seriousness, digital gaming is not for me, and I don't think anybody who's ever watched me doesn't understand that. But at the same time, if I'm not naive, I've been saying for years that this was on the horizon. It inevitably will come. It's just a matter of when. It is possible the next generation cycle is the first one where they just say we're only doing digital infrastructure. I could easily see Microsoft coming out with a digital only platform and being like, look, we're gonna get some blowback from all the physical media enthusiasts, but we're just gonna have to eat that and say this is the future and we don't really care if you're on board or not. Because if any company could get away with that and not care, it would be them. Sony, I don't really know what they would do. I'm sure they would prefer to be all digital, but I think they would also love to be able to capitalize on Microsoft not doing it. You know what I mean? Nintendo is the most likely to do another physical iteration system, but their physical, it's ironic actually, their Switch games are probably the least future-proof of any physical format we've ever had because of that certificate problem, where if you duplicate the certificate like they do in pirate cards, it effectively ruins the original to some extent, at least its ability to work connected to the internet, which is a whole different discussion. But yeah, so I'm with you, Rob, in the sense that as I get older, I'm less and less likely to care about this anymore. Not because digital is swaying me, but just because it's like, dude, I'm 37 now. I'll be reaching 40 by the time this new generation were to launch. And I've actually said on record in videos going back almost 15 years now that, like, by the time I'm 40, I may just not care about this. And I'm kind of on track for that to be the situation, because if, you know, these new systems are all digital, in a sense, they're almost doing me a favor because I don't have to support them. I don't have to care anymore. And I will have, I'm like, dude, I've got thousands of video games that I've collected over the course of my life. There's tons of endless adventures and experiences for me to have in there that I've never, you know, played before. I'll be fine. I'm not an immortal. You know, at some point I will die, and therefore there's only so many games you can realistically play. So the only thing that I think realistically could get me to be like, oh, dude, there's a PS6 coming out. It's digital only. So the one thing that might make me buy it, I guess, maybe, would be if they're like, yeah, we're doing like Shenmue 4 exclusively on PC or exclusively on PS6, and it's digital only. I'm like, that's the one thing where I'd be like, okay, my physical edition of Shenmue 4 is the PS6 box. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Hold your nose and play it.
Yeah, that would be like the one case where that might be possible. I always maintained when I was younger that a digital-only version of Shenmue 3 I wouldn't support, and I maintained that would have been the case at that age. As I get older, I'm like, well, you know, it's either this or you never play it, and that may be the case someday, who knows. But hopefully it's not. But yeah, that's kind of... I'm going down with the ship on physical media. That's just how it is. But in some ways, like... I guess when the ship goes down, I'll be like the violin players on the Titanic. I'm just resigned to my fate, you know? Abdullah, how about you?
I have a very similar answer to you guys, in the sense that I don't see it stopping. I think it's just going to get more and more, obviously, because it's cost effective. And the sad part is the loss of control, because, as you know, you don't really own digital media, right? It just can go anytime. Yeah, it's anytime. So, but at the same time, there are many games from many consoles that, as you said, endless adventures that if you think about playing, probably will extend your lifetime, and if you have maybe until your grandchildren's lifetime. It's it's something you can't stop. So try to enjoy as much as you have. But even if you try to be optimistic, I think, like I think Rob said it, a PS6 probably, and then whatever Nintendo's gonna do. That's probably where the end of the line is, given how the trends are going now. Like, for example, the PS5, you got the digital and disc version. Like, started popping up. So, looks like it. There's nothing.
Wouldn't it be kind of... Sorry. Wouldn't it be kind of interesting? So, like, there is... so every once in a while, and you guys might have noticed this recently, there has been a slight resurgence in physical media, at least in films and television. More people are suddenly more into Blu-rays, and they're getting more irritated by streaming services, so they're less likely to support them now. Which is, even Disney has caught wind of that. They started selling some of their Disney Plus exclusive shows on Blu-ray, things like The Mandalorian, Loki, a lot of the Marvel shows, Star Wars, Andor, whatever. Wouldn't it be really interesting, hypothetically, if PS6 came out, Xbox Next, or whatever you want to call it, all that stuff is all digital, and people just kind of not so much revolt against it, but they're just like, as time goes on, they're like, I don't like the fact that whenever they put a game up there, I don't really own it. It never goes on sale because there's no competition. Like, all the things that we are always preaching about, the problems of digital media. You know, games getting pulled for no apparent reason, all that sort of stuff. And people are just like, there's a sudden resurgence in physical media where, like, PS7 suddenly has a disc drive again. Wouldn't that be like a weird... like, you know, bring it back around type of thing?
I think the difference between the film and music, as opposed to video games, is that video games people still, if they are going to, enjoy them digitally, it's still an a la carte experience. Like, they're still, for the most part, buying, a game at $30. If there was no streaming service apps, like no Netflix, no HBO Max, no Hulu, nothing like that, and you still had to, went back to like the iTunes model, where you would buy seasons of a show digitally and have a digital copy of it. I think part of this revolting against digital films is more towards the streaming service aspect.
Correct. The distribution method.
Yeah, the distribution method. Like, it's reliant on internet, and you are beholden to the company and the licenses that they are providing. So, I don't know of anybody nowadays, in their right mind that has like a digital movie collection, other than stuff that they pirated,
Right.
They're not going on to Amazon and spending $30 on a digital copy of Avatar 2. If they want a copy of Avatar 2, they will go and buy a Blu-ray of it or a DVD.
That's interesting, because obviously that's not how it worked with music. Like, music, people did actually buy, and I think we've even talked about it. There was that guy who tried to sue Apple because he had like $10,000 worth of music, and they just took it away from him.
Yeah.
I think he lost, by the way. But there has to be people that do that with movies, but they probably there hasn't been like a big case about it, or at least that's not the general trend. So it's basically, you have like these two different potential outcomes based on two different industries. So it's going to be curious, but part of why that is the case still with video games is fundamentally the competition of it, as far as options on distribution, whether
True.
it's physical editions as well as brands. So it's not just PC, it's also Xbox, it's Nintendo, it's PlayStation, etc. If you're consolidating those and you're narrowing it down to, if you get to an all digital ecosystem and you want a new game from Nintendo, your exclusive choice is the method by which Nintendo chooses to distribute it, which is digitally on their ecosystem and nothing more. And that game lives and dies by that system. And the same would go, of anything Xbox, PlayStation, or potentially on PC, depending on what the game is. But the other thing that goes with that is that exclusives have, aside from Nintendo, have become kind of a rare thing in video games now, which is the other reason I think that the model is currently going that direction, is because if you're like, I want the new Assassin's Creed game, well, you literally can get it on like anything, because Ubisoft is going to put it on everything that's relevant. But if it's, and whereas streaming, full well that the new Disney movie is going to be on Disney Plus. It is not going to appear on Netflix. It is not going to appear on Peacock or Paramount Plus or any of that stuff. And I think that plays a role in what makes people sick of streaming. But we have to see where the video game industry kind of falls on that, because if for whatever reason Microsoft actually went ahead and said, okay, everything under the Microsoft umbrella, anything Activision, Bethesda, whatever it is digitally exclusive to just the Xbox ecosystem, like if they actually pulled that card, that's when you would be like, okay, now we have a feeling of real choice and people being split apart. And when they're getting split apart with only monopolistic choices, that's when you get to digital streaming. And that's where people are like, I want alternatives. And in the case of movies and TV shows, that goes with physical media still having a pull. So I guess what I'm saying is, it is possible we see a generation come up where it's PS6, where it's all digital and everybody's like, whatever, I guess this is how it is. And over the course of that generation, depending on certain corporate decisions, such as the example I just gave with Microsoft, that could generate enough disinterest that where they're like, I want my physical choice back, or I'm not really interested in this anymore. Just like streaming. Because if you remember when streaming started, everyone thought it was the greatest thing ever, because it was effectively just Netflix as a monopoly and they had everything. And then when Disney Plus came in as like the first real competitor, it split the base. And then everybody split the base and split the base multiple times because of legitimate options like Paramount Plus and HBO Max, etc. And here we are. So it's always interesting to see how certain policies like monopolies work really well in one industry and work very poorly in another. I just think it's fascinating more so than anything.
Mm. No, I agree.
I agree with that. I definitely agree with that.
All right. Well, is there anything else any of you guys want to say on this?
No.
No, not really.
Okay. Well, then, believe it or not, gentlemen, we are done here. So I want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon backers. Once again, Joseph, obviously, for joining us earlier. Spencer Purrier for the subject. Sinjeet for that particular subject we just discussed. Abdullah, obviously, you. And thank you, of course, for joining us here. As well as Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, and Trey Wagner. Once again, Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Trey Wagner, and Rob, thank you, dude, for joining us as always.
Yeah, I just want to kind of take a sec and just kind of make a brief announcement to all the listeners, all 25 of you. If you've been listening to this podcast for many years, I've been on, as Adam's co-host for over 4 years now, which is insane to think. And insane to say. Mm-hmm. And while I've enjoyed my time, I've been talking with Adam that you're probably going to start seeing a little bit less of me, kind of going forward. My schedule is absolutely insane. While I'm going to continue to be a part of this podcast, might not be a regular occurrence anymore. So I just wanted to take a second and thank Adam and thank all the listeners, as well as Joseph and Abdullah for kind of being part of this crew with me. And I'll catch you guys next time.
Yeah, basically he'll show up when his schedule permits, and when it doesn't, it doesn't. We'll just see how it goes. But thank you, gentlemen. If Rob, if it is a while since till the next time you're on here, thank you as always for your service. And
thank you for your service.
Yeah, you're like you're in the military. I'll pester you.
Wait. That means
possible though.
That means I'm not keeping Rob anymore.
Oh, I'm all you got, baby.
Okay. All right.
We'll
just leave that
send
to
you
the
some article of Rob clothing for you or something.
No, it's unfortunate, but I wish you all the best.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you.
No problem.
Oh no, he'll still show up from time to time. It just may not be an expected thing every month. It'll just be like whenever he's available.
Well, that makes it
so
fun,
Rob,
yeah?
with that, and yeah, it'll be a gamble every month. It'll be like, is this a Rob month or is this a good month? So we'll find out. I'm just kidding. But anyway, thank you guys for joining us. Please, as always, do me a favor: like the video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that before, and of course, check out all the social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon. Again, if you want to support this and all the other videos, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for watching. Also, there's the Discord and my travel channel. Thank you so much as always, and we'll see you all later.